Very much for coming tonight. Just want to do a very brief introduction to Geraint. This is a second in a series of 3 talks based around research that's been going on connected with the AA collections, so collections in the library, the archives, and the photo library. So I'm sure many of you know Geraint already. Worked for English Heritage, or Historic England, I should say, and coordinated national studies of post-war schools and commercial buildings, and of course has contributed many articles to journals including architectural history, etc. Piers is incredibly busy right now, as you've seen flyers for 2 books going out. I think there's the Howell Killick Partridge Amis book scheduled for release in June, is it? Yep. And then one on Pomo with Elaine Harwood coming out a few months later. So we're very lucky, really, to have him here tonight talking about Edward Reynolds, whose extraordinary career, relatively unknown figure, studied here in the mid to late 50s. And we're delighted to have Charlotte, his daughter, here as well today. So really, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Geraint. There are drinks served in the back, in the North Jury Room at the back afterwards. So if you'd all like to join us. And also, if you'd like to have a look at some of the material gathered from the archives and from the library on the table, as long as you keep the wine away from it. So, Geraint.
Thanks very much, Ed. Okay, well, that's great. So I was invited by Ed, another Edward, to give this talk, and it feels really fitting to be here at the AA, where Edward Reynolds studied 60 years ago. So I'd like to start by thanking Ed for his help and encouragement, and also Charlotte, Edward Reynolds' daughter, for telling me about her father and for giving me access to his papers and drawings. When Ed mentioned about this talk, my first thought was to base the talk on Howell Killick Partridge Amis and their AA connections. But in the end, I decided to pursue an offshoot of my research for the book, and I'm glad that I did so. But for those wanting more on HKPA, the book will be coming out next month, so that's my plug. So let's start with HKPA. Bill Howell, John Killick, John Partridge, and Stan Amis, from left to right, first worked together at the London County Council, where they designed housing described by their friend Peter Smithson as an act of homage to Le Corbusier. Between this and the mature and consistent vocabulary they developed in practice in the 1960s lies an intriguing transitional period, which was characterized by experimentation and eclecticism. At this point, they were still in contact with the Smithsons, Rayner Banham, and others, and using small-scale commissions, domestic work, and competition entries to work their way through the implications of the new brutalism. One of the most idiosyncratic ingredients of this formative period, say between about 1956 and 61, is the use of complex non-rectilinear geometries, non-right-angle geometries. Examples in their work include the faceted elevations of the 1959 Churchill College scheme and the prismatic plan of Ackland Burley School. At their work for colleges in Oxford and elsewhere, they applied their expertise in precast concrete to create the more buildable but nonetheless striking form of boxed-out windows, which you see here. Conventionally, one would place these trends in the context of the formal freedoms that succeeded Le Corbusier's chapel at Ronchon and the rediscovery of the pre-war avant-garde. But as I worked my way through the book, it was a revelation to discover that a significant influence on their work during this period was a short-lived but brilliant architect named Edward Reynolds. He was born in 1926 and died of cancer at the age of 32 in January 1959. Raised in Portugal, he arrived in the London of post-war austerity in 1947. After a protracted period of training, he found his way into the LCC and the mentorship of Bill Howell, who suggested he qualify here at the AA. He caused a sensation in this building. Peter Cook, a student slightly later, called him the one really original talent of the period, and his influence extended far beyond Bedford Square. In his history of modern architecture, Kenneth Frampton wrote that he exerted a decisive influence on the development of brutalism. So why has no one heard of him? Today, the name of Edward Reynolds has all but disappeared from living memory. There are only now a few people who knew him firsthand. The story that follows has had to be pieced together from small fragments and clues. It's an incomplete picture, but nonetheless, I think, an intriguing and important one. Edward Louis Reynolds was the second of 4 children from a well-to-do Anglo-Portuguese family. 2 Reynolds brothers emigrated to Portugal in the mid-19th century, where they established a successful business trading cork and wine. But Edward's mother claimed that he took after her side of the family, who were related to the aristocratic Conde de Benet family. He was born and grew up in Cascais, a coastal town 30 kilometers west of Lisbon, and attended St. Julian's School in nearby Carcavelos. His exercise books from his school days are filled with drawings of boats, mechanical inventions, landscapes, people, and horses, but there are also sketches of strange rustic houses accompanied by precisely annotated plans. And he started to study architecture off his own bat. Reynolds' architectural ambitions were encouraged by his family, and after the war, his aunt Christina arranged for him to be articled for 6 years to S.B. Caulfield, an architect based in South Kensington, while he studied part-time at the Regent Street Polytechnic School of Architecture. Reynolds arrived in London in August 1947, 4 days before his 21st birthday. Sidney Burgoyne Kitchener Caulfield, then aged 70, was a living link to the Gothic revival and the arts and crafts movement, having been articled to J.L. Pearson and led the Department of Architecture at the Central School of Arts and Crafts from 1910. He talked of W.R. Letheby, Edward Johnston, and Eric Gill. But by 1947, his practice was subsisting on war damage reparation work and must have felt as much of an antiquity as the system of pupillage itself. Reynolds befriended 2 bright young assistants. The first was Arthur Baker, who in 1950 went on to join the LCC Architects Department, working under Bill Howell, Gillian Sarson, John Killick, and Sandy Wilson on housing projects. It may be that Arthur Baker introduced Reynolds to this group, although he doesn't now recall doing so. The second was the anarchist writer, social historian, and sometime architect Colin Ward. He recalled being commended by Caulfield to go and study the bombed-out ruins of St. John's Church at Red Lion Square, one of Pearson's London churches where enemy action had exposed a full-sized cross-section of a Gothic structure, like an anatomical specimen, an idea I'll come back to. Baker recalled the office, and I quote, "Caulfield's office consisted of the living room of his house in Emperor's Gate in South Kensington. After I'd been working there a short time, Edward suddenly turned up. At that time, Edward represented to me what it was like to be rich. He wore tailored suits and came back once a week from meeting with his solicitor with a wallet full of new pound notes. He also talked about his late nights spent at the fashionable nightclubs. A little later, we were joined by a third person in the office, a returning soldier, Colin Ward, a true anarchist, who seemed to spend all his time cutting and editing articles and writing editorials for the bi-weekly anarchist paper named Freedom. We all spent a lot of time discussing the all-important issues like politics and religion and had quite an effect on each other's way of thinking. After a working day at the office, Reynolds crossed Hyde Park to attend the evening classes of the Regent Street Poly. In a higher year was John Partridge. His architectural education was sponsored by an LCC training scheme for its employees. The school was established in 1891, with the aim of providing a practical and technical grounding for students destined for the building and construction trades. The Poly was a conservative school. Its continuing commitments to the orders and to line and wash renderings can be seen from Reynolds' second-year Doric study. It was run by older, rather remote figures. The classicist John S. Walkden was the overall head of the school, with Gordon Topliss and Robert Meadows in charge of the day and evening schools, respectively. The younger tutors, however, tended to be practitioners with a closer connection to the modern movement. Despite this somewhat less than inspiring environment, Reynolds' drawings suggest that he was navigating his own course through a changing architectural landscape. His third-year project, A House for a Curator of an Art Gallery, with its concertina glass screen, rubble end walls, and timber pergola, suggests the vernacular modernism of Bentley Wood, Sergei Chermayev's pre-war house, or the houses designed by Marcel Breuer after his arrival in the United States, while the render and framed picture windows perhaps reflect a Scandinavian influence. By 1951, the year of the Festival of Britain, a pure rationalism is apparent in his fifth-year project for a seaside concert hall, in tune with his hero Mies van der Rohe, the Smithsons Hans Stanton School, and their efforts to, quote, find out how to use Mies's methods without any mannerism, unquote. This seems to be a reinforced concrete frame, a material he would become strongly associated with. The ramps and balconies threaded through a square grid of columns suggest an awareness of Giuseppe Turagni, while the pier-like structure, seen on the top right here, seems to extend out into the sea. The scheme is rendered in a single thin line, with a Mondrian-like blocks of primary colours pasted on. His contemporary project for a debating hall at Regent's Park is a full-bloodedly brutalist essay in board-marked concrete, complete with random fenestration and exposed downstand beams. Reynolds left the Regent Street Poly in about 1952, having gained the RIBA intermediate qualification. He next took a short-lived job with Tripe and Wakeham, a firm then specialising in industrial and newspaper buildings. Peter Wormersley was working there at about the same time. In October 1953, Edward got married to his fiancée, Anne Russell. She was an interior designer from Northern Ireland, working for Casson & Conda, later at the furniture and display section of the LCC Architects Department. Edward had met Anne through a friend from the Polytechnic, to whom she was then engaged. He introduced himself as Pedro. Only later did she find out her real name. Much later, some of his colleagues and acquaintances would refer to him by the same nickname. Perhaps England brought out his Portuguese side and vice versa. In March 1954, Reynolds joined the LCC Housing Division, then at the peak of its post-war reputation. He was soon assigned to the team working on the Roehampton Lane estate, later known as Alton West. This group was headed by Colin Lucas, a pre-war renown as 1/3 of Cornell, Ward and Lucas, but directing the design was Bill Howell, John Killick, John Partridge and Stan Amis. Partridge had entered the LCC in the 40s at age 18, but the other three were ex-servicemen who'd met here at the Post-War Architectural Association. Their concept was based on Le Corbusier's unrealized plan for Saint-Dié and combined groups of tall blocks with short terraces to preserve a fine landscape while maintaining a relatively high density. By the time Reynolds arrived, their layout had been approved by the council, and Howell, Killick and Partridge were overseeing detailed design and construction. Reynolds was one of a number of assistants in the team, a role more associated with drawing than with designing. Nonetheless, he was allowed to make two significant creative contributions. The first concerned Howell's 5 12-story masonette blocks that stand sentinel over St. Richmond Park. Their imagery and proportions were clearly derived by the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, although their planning and internal layout were quite different. In place of the Unité's colossal pilotti, were substituted for pragmatic reasons a grove of slender cylindrical supports more akin to Corbusier's pre-war work. It was Reynolds' idea to expose their pile caps, that is, the upper part of their foundations, to create an intricate surface of steps and bases which emphasized the falling ground. This detail, which struck Howell as a sort of Giant's Causeway playground, and James Gowan as much like a town chap and as sympathetic, was perhaps the brutalist equivalent of the cobbled floorscapes of the townscape movement. It's the single-built structure which can be attributed to Reynolds, and he would surely have welcomed its listing at grade 2 star, along with the rest of the 5 slabs. For the teams designing a large housing complex, the drawing out and detailing of standardized bays and plans was occasionally relieved by a piece of one-off design. The brutalist jeu d'esprit of the Roehampton boiler house proudly proclaims the district's heating system, which served the tall blocks on the estate. A boiler house, based on its specifications, was one of the AA projects set for several years by fourth-year unit master John Killick. Reynolds was given a free hand in the design of another ancillary building at Roehampton, the maintenance depot. His original design of March 1956, seen here, has recently been rediscovered. A modified version was published in 1959, but it was never built. The works yard is enfolded by curved screen walls of board-marked concrete, studded with randomly disposed boxed-out windows. A blob-like pod of offices pushes into the membrane-like perimeter wall, like a collection of cells under the microscope. The curvilinear plan hugs the contours of a sloping site and skirts around mature trees. Its sculptural form and elaborate fenestration was presumably justified by the fact that it would have been overlooked by adjacent housing. After Reynolds left the LCC, his design was rationalized, with the freehand curve straightened and boldly radiused corners added. Writing in the AA Journal, Howell describes Reynolds' design as an interesting piece of early curly. This was apparently an AA term of the period. John Partridge associated it with the fifth-year tutor, Peter Smithson, and his disapproval of post-Ronchamp formalism at the AA. Partridge's own 1958 competition entry for an infant school at Wokingham clearly shows the influence of Reynolds' design. Roy Stout, another assistant in the Roehampton group, sat at the next drawing board to Reynolds and remembers him working on a personal project, we're not certain what, which already combined Corbusian influences with his own non-right angle geometry. He clearly had creative potential, yet, according to Howell, he was suffering from low morale or self-doubt. Howell encouraged him to complete his architectural qualifications at the AA, where Killick was by then fourth-year master. Edward Reynolds gained a major county award and enrolled at the fourth year of the AA in autumn 1956. But before looking at his AA projects, I want first to explore his network of contacts in that period. Reynolds was 30 when he entered the AA, a mature student and older even than most of the ex-servicemen who arrived at the post-war AA. Bill Howell, for example, was 26 when he joined the fourth year in 1948. Students in the upper years tended to spend less time here at Bedford Square than the earlier years, doing much of their designing at home. Yet Reynolds' presence at the AA was noted by James Gowan, a third-year tutor, and I quote, "In the studio, as I bludgeoned my students into action with customary delicacy, Edward Reynolds, a year or so ahead and working on his elegant projects, would look up from time to time and exchange a quiet smile." Reynolds socialized with fellow students, particularly Elon Lee, Paul Drake, Temasp Kargat, and Roman Holter. Here are some of the recollections of Richard Raines, an American student in his class. He knew all the right sort of people, Howell, Killick, and he had very good connections. He introduced me to Portuguese wine, and he introduced me to the city. He had an accent, because his father was English and his mother was Portuguese. He knew the tutors and also people outside of the AA. As a result of his age and his LCC connections, Reynolds was in social contact with some of the younger tutors at the AA, but especially James Gowan, John Killick, Peter Smithson, who became a fifth-year master in 1958, and John Partridge, who became a fifth-year design tutor the same year. He also knew the visiting critics, Bill Howell, James Startling, and Douglas Stephen. Although only a few years older than Reynolds, these were experienced designers supplementing their fledgling careers with part-time teaching. One senses that Reynolds' friendships with Howell, Killick, and Smithson in particular were based on mutual respect, a sense of irreverent humour, and cultural affinities. Their work was underpinned by an intellectual rigour and a return to engagement with the European avant-garde, underpinned by the role of the Howells and the Smithsons in the transition from Siam to Team 10. Reynolds was part of a group of architects who would regularly meet on Saturdays at the so-called French pub on Dean Street in Soho, including, from right to left on this photograph, Douglas Stevens, with his back to us, his wife Margaret Dent, working at the LCC, Sandy Wilson, looking very much like Sandy Wilson in this photo, Edward Reynolds and Anne, Alan Cahoon with his wine glass, and others formed effectively a social circle, including Bob Maxwell, also a tutor at the AA, Sam Stevens, and the engineer Frank Newby. Many of these acquaintances lived in North London. Peter Cook referred to them as the Primrose Hill Circuit, including Wilson's neighbour, the historian cum critic Rayner Banham, who regularly hosted Saturday discussions over coffee. Reynolds also knew Thomas Sam Stevens, whose Marylebone High Street flat was another gathering place. This loose circle of London-based architects, and I've, in an amateurish way, tried to sketch out the network here, was connected by a web of intersecting allegiances. Many were current or former employees of the LCC. Others had studied at the AA or the Liverpool School of Architecture. But there were also connections to artists, graphic designers, and others in the visual arts world. The Smithsons and Banham were core architect members of the independent group who met at the Institute of Contemporary Arts. Along with Wilson, Sterling, and Newby, they were the principal architect contributors to the 1956 exhibition This Is Tomorrow at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. In 1956, Howell, Killick, Gowan, and the Smithsons were at an intermediate stage in their architectural development. For Howell and Killick, the second half of the 1950s was a rich but footloose period of casting about. Their work of this intermediate period, on which Reynolds was an important influence, is characterized by diversity and formal license. The Smithsons built little, but thought and wrote a great deal between 1954 and 62. Peter Cook called it their random period. Open or limited competitions invited experimentation and a break in the rhythm of practice. The somewhat abstract, intuitive, non-iterative nature of competition design can be compared with the projects set in the 4th and 5th years, an affinity which is underscored by the fact that AA students were occasionally recruited as draftsmen on their tutors' competition drawings. The AA of the early 1950s can be characterized by a neutral, pragmatic, clear-headed rationalism based on pre-war Corbusier, Alvar Aalto, and de Stijl. The classic example of this is the 1950 cohort, which included Patrick Hodgkinson, Neve Brown, John Miller, Adrian Gale, and Kenneth Frampton. By 1956, however, Principal Michael Patrick could already draw a distinction between the students of the immediate post-war years, with their belief that prefabrication and the machine might impose order, and a recent trend towards a coarse and robust architecture characterized by solid walling and small, irregularly disposed windows. The third-year tutor, the late Leonard Manassi, attributed the, quote, farouche air of that year's summer exhibition to a rush of Ronchamp to the head. Of the following year's summer exhibition, dominated by the work of Reynolds and his friend Carregat, Patrick commented, "Today, the general mode of expression is for the irregular, the severe, the brooding, and sometimes the convulsive." Along with late Le Corbusier, there was a renewed interest in the Mediterranean, the East, and so-called primitive art. Manassi also drew attention to a growing interest in Antoni Gaudí, citing a strongly modeled project for a city centre in Mumbai by Manek Dungaji. Dungaji's final year project for a rural ashrama in Mumbai state dazzled everyone, recalled Gowan. The design, an open-work concrete cube with a curved parasol, was like an exploded diagram of Corbusier's governor's palace at Chandigarh. Reynolds' first project at the AA was for high-density housing at Little Venice in Paddington, the confluence of the Paddington branch of the Grand Union Canal and the Regent Canal. We don't know the exact site, but this is my best guess, outlined in blue from the descriptions given. It was, in any case, 23 acres in extent and scheduled in the County of London plan for redevelopment. In 1952, Sir G. Cadley and Patrick Horsburgh proposed High Paddington, a vertical town of 8,000 inhabitants over the Paddington goods yard, seen here to the south. Reynolds undertook the project jointly with another student in his year. Ailon Lee came from a wealthy Shanghai family who fled to Hong Kong after the Communist Revolution. We know almost nothing about the project. No drawings are known to survive, and the sole piece of evidence is a single photograph of a rather rough and ready cardboard model. It's described in one publication as a part model, which implies that, to me, that the model is a portion of a larger scheme. In any case, it shows a four-story structure raised on a vaulted undercroft. Underneath a unité style of projecting balconies is a disordered array of L-shaped windows. Perhaps this represents the front and back walls of alternating maisonettes. The concert hall at Trafalgar Square is Reynolds' best-known work. In Peter Cook's estimation, it was, and is, the most original shape to have come out of the AA during the second part of the 20th century. Somehow total, somehow inimitable, unquote. It was completed in the spring term of 1957 as a group project with Ailon Lee and Paul Drake. Drake, too, had made the transition from the Regent Street Poly to the AA. He met AA graduate Peter Ahrens while working for Slater, Mobley and Uren on Sanderson House, and spent the rest of his working life at Ahrens, Burton and Correlec. The project was based on the so-called Hampton site next to Wilkins National Gallery, the Hamptons department store having been cleared after bomb damage. And it was for many years a car park until it was redeveloped, of course, as the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery. In his youth, Reynolds had enjoyed going to Lisbon's Opera House. According to Paul Drake, he was not much interested in music, but fascinated by people. The plan of the AA concert hall was as much based on the ritual of concert going, the arriving, the socializing, the people watching, as it was on the performance. By splitting up the seating into angled groups, the intention was that the audience could see each other and their reactions to the performance. The faceted treatment of the exterior was justified by the auditorium design with its steep rear rake, angled rows, and acoustic reflector ceiling. And we have some of these drawings on display in the front here. The auditorium was to be lined in lacquered plywood, a hazy mauve in colour, with olive green velvet seats, and a royal box in poppy red padded leather. Reynolds' specified colour references can be seen at the bottom of this slide. The foyers and other public spaces were of exposed, shuttered, reinforced concrete, with marble floors, emperor red stairs, and indirect reflected coloured lighting, implied by his sketch here. According to Drake, the group never decided on the exterior finishes, wavering between shattered concrete and white mosaic, the latter perhaps reflecting their interest in Lasden's Royal College of Physicians. The complex internal circulation was based on their observations of the way people moved diagonally across the site between Trafalgar Square to Piccadilly Circus. Wide flights of stairs, serving those coming from Trafalgar Square, from Piccadilly, and from a basement car park, funneled concert goers into an asymmetrical foyer dominated by a cranked stair. The processional route continued to a first-floor ambulatory with views over the square and access to pairs of external staircases serving the auditorium. The spiring, vortex-like circulation pattern and off-center entrances were played off against the bilateral symmetry of the external form. The idea of the route as an organizational device owes much to the Smithson schemes for Golden Lane and Sheffield University. The scheme is contemporary with Hans Scharoun winning competition entry for the Berlin Philharmonic Concert Hall. The latter was designed in 1956 and published the following year. We don't know if the trio saw it, although Drake would later comment, "We wanted to do then what Scharoun was to do 10 years later." There's a similar combination of symmetry with an expressionist angularity. The engineer Frey Otto called Scharoun's auditorium the room of 1,000 angles. But there are important differences. At the Berlin Hall, on the right, the stage is pulled forward so that the orchestra is in the round, with seating broken into angled banks of between 100 and 300 people, creating a still more dynamic treatment of sightlines. The parallels with Hans Scharoun also raise the question of the influence of the organic functionalism of Scharoun and Hugo Haring on this generation of architectural students. In the late 50s, Peter Smithson was introducing his students to Adolf Meyer, Hans Meyer, Max Stamm, and Hugo Haring in lectures that would later be published in 1965 as the heroic period of modern architecture. Expressionism also had an illicit appeal, and Reynolds' charcoal renderings for the concert hall certainly recall Erich Mendelssohn's early sketches. Key features of the Trafalgar Square Concert Hall: its mammal-like bulk, its articulated skin of triangles, and the route as generator of its internal organization, were influenced by another competition entry of 1956. Alison and Peter Smithson, Bill and Jill Howell, John Killick, John Partridge and Stan Amis joined forces to enter the Sydney Opera House competition. Published in March 1957, this scheme was well known in AA circles. The two auditoria were canted from a central core, with escalators splaying out from foyers deep within the building. As at the Trafalgar Square Concert Hall, the raking auditoria generated the external form, in this case evoking a huge hulk beached on Benelong Point. Howell and Killick joked about their aircraft carrier phase. The submission text reads, and I quote, "The aesthetic is an architecture of facets, of irregular planes which envelop the whole building, outside and inside. The right angle is treated as a precious thing." T.S. Kargat, assisted with the drawings, went on to explore faceted ship-like forms in his AA project for Southampton Ocean Terminus. These schemes can be seen as part of a wider interest in comparative anatomy and biological pattern and form that has a long history. The post-war interest of AA students and the independent group on growth and form by the Scottish biology Darcy Thompson is quite well known, while Bill Howell and others drew inspiration from Viollet-le-Duc's illustration of a bat swing. In designing the interior of the Sydney Auditoria, Alison Smithson studied the physiology of tortoise shells. The lining was conceived as a jointed shell of red lacquered plywood, like a tortoise or armadillo inside out. The Reynolds-Drake-Lee Concert Hall, by contrast, more conventionally has a hard skin, and this Reynolds sketch spells out the connection between armor-like scales and a faceted architecture. Alon Lee also had an interest in living architecture, having studied zoology as an undergraduate in Shanghai, at one point keeping a crocodile in his bathtub. He liked to compare the energy, ventilations, pipes, and evacuations of a house to a living, breathing organism. This sort of architectural vitalism also flourished at the Poly, encouraged by the young practitioner tutors Howell, Stirling, and Douglas Stephen. In 1957, John Outram and Wilfred Marden started a student magazine called Polygon. Its third issue included the Reynolds-Drake-Lee Concert Hall, a zoo by Outram and Marden, and 3 bow list projects for the Furniture Manufacturers Association by Michael Webb, John Davison, and Robert Marney. Webb's project was featured in the pages of the Architectural Review, a radio talk by Nicholas Pevsner, and was exhibited in the 1961 Visionary Architecture Show at the New York Museum of Modern Art. He would later, of course, become a member of the Archigram group. At Howell's suggestion, Outram and Marden transferred to the AA. Outram described his 1959 Westminster Concert Hall as, I quote, like a bumblebee with VTOL boosters, unquote, with cladding like a rhino with a hide made of blued steel. It may have elicited the legendary remark by John Killick, "You seem to have produced a bad building and a rather good armadillo." Warren Chalk of Archigram later wrote of the zoomorphic trend, quote, "Capture an armadillo, put a plan inside it, watch it writhe, and a transformation takes place between architecture and magic." Many of these schemes, including the Reynolds Concert Hall and others I haven't got time to go into, were collaged on the front cover of Archigram 1, establishing a connection between them, the Hayward Gallery, designed by an LCC team, including Chalk and Ron Heron, and Ron Heron's Walking City proposal of 1964. Charles Jenks offered the sister term Howellism, characterized by pedestrian flow and erupted skin. HKPA's enjoyment of Reynolds' faceting and animal forms was acknowledged in this 1965 sketch, produced in the HKPA office as part of an in-house ideas competition for Darwin College, Cambridge. Reynolds' third-year project was a storage and dispatch warehouse for SPD Limited, a transport subsidiary of Lever Brothers, which developed refrigerated insulated vehicles to carry frozen foods. The name was chosen by Lord Leverhulme and stood for Speedy Prompt Delivery. The students were allocated a cramped bomb site in Bristol's industrial quarter, overshadowed by a railway bridge over the feeder canal. A steady level of illumination was required, but without direct sunlight and without solar gain. The traditional solutions, a north-light roof or a sawtooth roof, were complicated by the northeast-southwest alignment of the site. Reynolds' roof has angled north lights spanning diagonally between transverse folded plates. In geometrical, although not structural terms, the repeated asymmetry recalls the crazy vault over St. Hugh's Choir at Lincoln Cathedral. The SPD roof is as light and crystalline as the concert hall is heavy and plastic. The administrative accommodation was piled up to create a vertical feature on the right. This sculptural array of interlocking forms would have presented a prominent sight from the trains pulling out of Temple Mead Station. The contrast between the mundane programme, presumably set to focus student minds on structural engineering and working drawings, and Reynolds' geometric tour de force is pointed. The project, perhaps informed by Reynolds' experience at Tripe and Wakeham, manipulates the industrial vernacular into a rippling skin of light steel and plate glass. Architects were becoming alive to the anonymous and self-conscious British engineering tradition precipitated by the Industrial Revolution. The following year, in 1958, J.M. Richards' The Functional Tradition in Early Industrial Buildings came out, illustrated by Eric Demare's iconic photographs. The impact of Reynolds' design was immediate. Paul Drake cribbed it for his own SPD project. Its influence is apparent in lightweight roofs designed by John Partridge for the Furniture Industry Research Association at Stevenage on the left, and for the gymnasium at Ackland Burley School. Far better known, however, is another shed with a folded plate, north-light roof, and a sculptural tower. Stirling and Gowan's Leicester Engineering Building, on the right here. Both partners knew Reynolds and admired his work. Peter Buchanan claimed, quote, that Stirling had seen it at an Architectural Association crit he had attended before rushing back to his office to redesign his already well-developed scheme. It's a great story, but the timing doesn't quite fit. The Leicester Building Committee first wrote to Stirling in June 1959, some 2 years after the crit. But it was Gowan who led on the design of the workshop block in 1959 to 60, and he told Ellis Woodman, quote, Professor Parkes, the head of the department, wanted a north light, which forced you to set the skylights on the diagonal. The overhang was derived from a project for a warehouse by a student who was at the AA when I was teaching there, Edward Reynolds. Another connection is the structural engineer, Frank Newby, of F.J. Samueli. He taught Reynolds structures at the AA and later assisted Gowan with the Leicester roof. Reynolds' influence on Leicester was first remarked upon by Peter Eisenman in his 1975 essay, Real and English, followed by Kenneth Frampton, who illustrated Reynolds' SPD in his Modern Architecture, A Critical History of 1980. Reynolds' final year thesis was interrupted by his illness. After his death, Bill Howell collected up and submitted his drawings so he could posthumously qualify. Each student got to choose their own fifth-year thesis projects, which occupied their second and third terms. Edward Reynolds' project is entered as distillery in the AA register for January 1959, but this is crossed out and corrected to hotel in Ireland. He returned to the AA in the autumn of 1958 under Peter Smithson, where the project is recorded as a built landscape. The notional site was Mill Cove near Rosscarbery in County Cork on the southwest coast of Ireland. The small sloping promontory in the centre of this photo marks the spot. Edward and Anne discovered this landscape while visiting their friend Estrid Bannister. She was a Danish journalist and a consultant to Alan Lane of Penguin Books, who himself had a holiday cottage at Rosscarbery Bay, designed by Edward Samuel. Reynolds chose a site and a mixed-use programme which combined scale, complexity, and freedom of expression. Through a sequence of preparatory sketches, it's possible to see the loose programme gradually coalesce into an aggregation of man-made cliffs and caves. Bill Howell, incidentally, was fascinated by caves and by cave dwelling. A series of informal and spontaneous presentation drawings, probably prepared for a jury, suggests an imaginative, uninhibited, and sensuous attitude to architectural design and to life in general. He imagined a fantasy resort hotel, somewhere to relax, socialize, and enjoy various leisure pursuits. In planning the hotel accommodation, he studied Yonel Shine's proposals for a mobile hotel cabin, and perhaps also the Smithson's Appliance House, published in April 1958. Here's a detail of that earlier sketch. A cluster of fragmented interlocking forms grows out of the rocky outcrop, given coherence by formal variation and consistency of materials. In the cross-section, at the top here, a meticulous organisation becomes apparent. Unlike the hill housing then being developed by Atelier Sonck at Siedlung Halen in Switzerland, it owes little to Le Corbusier's rock et robes terraces of 1949. As a concrete landscape of articulated terraces, walkways and ramps, it anticipates the brutalist crumble of the South Bank Art Centre, early archigram, and the action architecture trend in America. An advanced design for 1958, the hotel is simultaneously rational and romantic. It has something of the topographic and accumulative quality of the vernacular, of the Mediterranean hill towns, castles, and coastal fortifications with which Reynolds was familiar. In his obituary for Edward Reynolds, Bill Howell identified him as a key figure in a, quote, remarkable burst of originality, unquote, at the AA, quote, which produced the most original new look the AA has achieved since the Hertfordshire School wall-span era of almost 10 years ago. He thus drew a careful distinction between Reynolds' own work and the formalist excesses of the movement associated with him, which he described as a decadent picturesque and a vehicle for personal romantic expressionism, indeed. The crucial distinction Howell implied was the extent to which geometric complexity served the social, functional, and technological ends of the project, as opposed to the purely gestural. John Killick affirmed that Reynolds' quote, rich, marvelous, organic whole was the more marvelous for its complexity, astonishing plan organization, and complementary form. Rich praise from the notoriously meticulous critic, Killick. What they admired, and perhaps envied, was the close and reciprocal relationship that Reynolds established between form, social organization, and structure. In recognition of the fact that it was non-rectilinear geometry that usually provided the best fit with the morphology of the city or its circulation patterns, Peter Smithson used the term sweet geometry. I think sweet geometry suits Reynolds' work just as well. The Spanish poet García Lorca used the same expression in Theory and Play of the Duende, a 1933 lecture on artistic inspiration and creation, Duende loosely translating as the soul or spirit of evocation of a performance or artwork. He said, "There are neither maps nor exercises to help us find the Duende. We only know that he burns the blood like a poultice of broken glass, that he exhausts, that he rejects all the sweet geometry we have learnt." Edward Reynolds' story is a reminder of the importance of the unbuilt tradition. The fixation of histories of architecture upon the built is arbitrary in the sense that the process of developing and commissioning buildings is hardly one of natural selection, and permanence has only the slightest relation to meaning or significance in architecture. Peter Cook has written on unbuilt England and how the notion of the unbuilt befits a culture which has emerged rather than been defined, and which recognizes individuality rather than polemic, and celebrates empiricism rather than heroicism. When the history of Britain's unbuilt architecture is written, Edward Reynolds will surely command an important place within it. Thank you.
For amazing talk there. So if we can start with some questions straight away. Surely there must be some questions. Brian.
How did the difference and distinction between Reynolds's folded, angular and faceted work and the curvilinear bowelist work, how did that debate work out? Was there positions taken or what? Because there's
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean Reynolds also explored a kind of curvilinear vocabulary that emerges from Ronchamp and other works of Le Corbusier. And the two schools were talking to each other at that time, about 1956-58. For example, John Outram remembers visiting Reynolds in his home, and they were discussing their projects together. And he went on to publish Reynolds's work. And I've chosen to profile the Bauerlist schemes, but other other schemes at the Poly were exploring faceted geometries. But I suppose both form a kind of formalist reaction against, you know, the immediate post-war years at the AA and the kind of work, rationalistic work they were producing.
I mean, this was a period when the lost, or the previously lost, or nearly lost history of German Expressionism and Prague Expressionism was being rediscovered slowly. I'm sure Dennis Sharp would have told us all about that. And that is usually divided into organic versus crystalline tendencies. You know.
Yes, and the crystalline, does form a part of that expressionist heritage, which was then being rediscovered, as you suggest, through publication of Mendelssohn's sketchbooks. I think Smithson started lecturing on bringing these early projects in about 1956, and that lecture would evolve into the heroic period, that book he wrote.
Just one last point. I think in his book on brutalism, Banham invokes the term topology, and I've never quite followed exactly what he was driving at there.
Yeah, the term is invoked a lot. It's it's difficult to trace its meaning, but topography certainly. But yeah, there was certainly a shared interest in geometry. It's in relation to organising circulation.
Hello, this is a comment really rather than a question actually, but I was very intrigued by your description earlier of the sort of social group, especially the one standing outside the pub and the interlocking social groups. Because I remember one name from that, which is Sam Stevens, who was still around in the 70s, who several people may remember. And I just wonder if anybody has studied him, followed his career, knows what he achieved during his life. He was an extraordinary character, once met, never forgotten.
Yeah. I'd love to know more about him, and he's on the AA scene till about in the late 70s?
Yeah, Fred, would you comment on Sam Stevens? Yeah, I think well. Sam Stevens.
Not mine.
He knew everything. I mean, I guess that was Sam, wasn't he? He did literally know everything, which was a sort of his downfall in a way. He wasn't well, you know. I mean, I mean that seriously in a way that he was in conversation. He was liable to produce arguments and counter-arguments, and but he was given to moments of absolute brilliance. He wasn't the greatest editor of himself. How can I put it? But he was, you know, and I mean, he was absolute inspiration to generations of students here, probably valued more by the students, I think, than by. He was a slightly peripheral figure when I came to teach here. He was slightly, I suppose, you know, Archigram was sweeping in, you know, and Sam was just slightly sort of out of that charge of the.
I think he was a school friend of Alan Cahoon. He knew him in the 30s at school, and then he studied at Liverpool, didn't he, with Bob Maxwell and Colin Rowe, under Colin Rowe.
Colin Rowe.
I associate him as a Liverpool man.
Mm.
Two things struck me in preparing this talk about the culture of the AA. The first is it's kind of oral transmission, and this is where Edward Reynolds has suffered through his absence. But when I was researching the HKPA book, an awful lot of former employees of HKPA said, oh, there was this student, I can't remember his name, and everybody was talking about him, and he influenced everybody. As this kind of half-remembered, just leaving living memory. The other thing is the rapidity through which, through the changing student cohorts, with which ideas come and go, and things are moving on all the time. So by 1959, already you had this sort of formalistic geometry being replaced by a different conception of sort of the first year students coming in. It's really interesting, the AA connections.
Do you think they were aware yet of Japanese work with concrete? And because in the 50s, Japanese architecture was beginning to get kind of powered up, but I don't know whether it had yet reached kind of awareness threshold.
It's a really fascinating one, and I don't know. It certainly gets published, doesn't it? And it excites Nicholas Pevsner, who's immediately talking about it. Japanese students are not so much in evidence at the AA at the time. Lots of Indian students and lots of from Southeast Asia, but not so much Japan. It's really interesting parallels, and through the former employees of Le Corbusier that go out there and working in Japan in concrete. It's really interesting.
Did you go back to Portugal at all for any projects?
Sadly not, because he died so young. He was going back and forth. He did go back to Portugal on a number of occasions, and no.
He certainly wasn't well off. He may have looked it, and people might have thought he was with the suits and everything, but he was not.
But he was taking photographs of some of the buildings in Portugal.
I found them, and they've just been developed. Buildings in Portugal, modern. Oh no, modern buildings in Portugal. Of the time, and they are quite. I actually one of them I walked past many times. It hasn't improved with age. But so he was interested, but he never went. He didn't have time. And he also, when he was in Portugal, he was very keen on being very English, very British, and he insisted on being called Edward. And so he very much embraced being here. But when he was here, obviously, then he was, as Geraint said, he told my mother until they were engaged that he was called Bill. So whether he would have ever gone back to Portugal, I don't know. I think he was very rooted here. And all the circles in which he moved and the friends that he made. I think my mother used to say that perhaps he might have gone to Hong Kong with Alan Lee. She used to say that might have been an outcome. But I think he was very rooted with Bill.
Yeah. What happens to that generation at the AA and the Poly is interesting, because some of them go into the LCC, and especially the Special Works Division and the out-county towns programme. A lot of them go into that, such as John Outram and Kargat, who I spoke to, who's still living in Mumbai. And others go into it, they worked either for practices like ABK, HKPA, or set up on their own. So it's that impossible conundrum, isn't it? Trying to imagine what would have happened.
Do we know what happened to Alan Lee?
Yeah, he set up a practice in Hong Kong, and he died about 8 years ago. Yeah, quite a successful commercial practice. Lee and Z, it was called. Mm.
Oh, just to say, James Gowan definitely thought of him as an incredibly high regard for him. And, you know, James was a difficult person to impress, and so he had a sort of hero worship of him, really. And also, in conversation, one thought of a whole generation of brilliant people, and sort of the best, you know, in jazz, most obviously Charlie Parker, but in, you know, Dennis Brain, James Dean, you know, suddenly there was this sort of flux of, as if, you know, the gods, in some sort of peculiar way, decided to remove the most brilliant ones, you know, from, and I know certainly James and I would sometimes gossip in sort of around this subject, you know.
So James Gowan certainly mentions Reynolds many times in his writings. There are several references to Reynolds. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can continue this over drinks. Thank you once again. That was an amazing talk and real revelation. Yeah, so maybe if I can just make